7:07 now, and if you're just joining us, welcome to the programme. We start this hour by talking about the tainted blood scandal that affected patients in the late 1970s and early 1980s, because a group of Assembly members is now calling on the UK government to hold a public inquiry. Thousands of people were given contaminated blood and as a result developed hepatitis C and HIV. 70 people in Wales have died over the decades. Last year, the Welsh Government announced extra financial support for patients living here who had received contaminated blood. David Thomas is from Penarth and was infected with hepatitis C, but has recently been given the all clear.
I'm a haemophiliac. I was diagnosed with hepatitis C in around about 1995. I was 24, I think, that I was informed that I had it. I went on to become sort of borderline cirrhotic. I'm part of a large haemophilia family, cousins who also have the disease, some of which were also infected through contaminated blood products given via the NHS when we were sort of largely children.
So that was David Thomas from Penarth, and we'll be hearing more from David just after 8 o'clock. But first, let's speak to Lynne Kelly, who's the chair of Haemophilia Wales and joins us in the studio. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's the scale of this that's so startling, isn't it? There were thousands of people affected. How did this happen?
Right, I think, as you say, it's the scale of this, and this is what people don't understand. Haemophilia is a clotting disorder requiring factor replacement therapy, the factor 8 or factor 9. And in the 1970s, a new treatment became available called factor 8 or factor 9. And this was made from pooling blood products from up to 40,000 donors at a time. And these products were commercially manufactured primarily in America, and they were imported into the UK, and consequently 280 in Wales were infected with HIV and hepatitis C, mainly hepatitis C, and the problem being is just the enormity of this disaster, and because it happened so many years ago. Many of these haemophiliacs were infected as children and babies. Sadly, many died. But unfortunately, though, the survivors are living with the consequences of the infection.
So those blood products, they should have been screened and weren't?
And screened, often from paid donors. Warnings were ignored by successive governments. Lord Owen, who was health minister at the time, he set aside funds for self-sufficiency. This never happened. It's well documented that when he went back to look for his papers, those papers had been destroyed. There's never been a public inquiry. And we feel that the deaths of 70 people in Wales and over 2,011 people in the UK deserves a public inquiry.
There were calls for a public inquiry last year, and the government at that point said, well, they said that no, there wouldn't be one, and that they had put reforms in place. They'd also increased the amount of money that was available for compensation to 125 million. Was that not enough?
Right, so the 125 million is for England only. There's never been any compensation paid because the government will not admit fault. Fault has never been found because they've always refused a public inquiry. And therefore people are living in intense poverty. For example, the reform that you mentioned last year, that's actually a shameful £10,000 one-off payment for widows. Bearing in mind, lots of people were widowed very young and have had to bring up their families on their own. £10,000 goes nowhere near addressing that.
And without a public inquiry, can we be sure that this couldn't happen again?
We couldn't, and this is why there needs to be a public inquiry, because we need to look at mistakes of the past and learn lessons for the future. So there's every reason to, the fact that so many people have died, there's clear evidence that, there was state's mishandling of the situation. The fact that it took 13 years to gain self-sufficiency in blood products, so those products continued to be imported, and the whole blood supply was contaminated with either HIV or hepatitis C.
And there's a huge element of trust here, isn't it? Because if you're you're receiving a product like blood, you just assume that it's been checked.
You assume it's safe, and also this is one of the problems that we come across. People weren't warned of the risks. Patients weren't warned. Parents weren't warned. So children were injected with treatment that, contained these lethal viruses. And the problem being that there is this trust issue, and that has to carry a penalty.
And are you still, in Haemophilia Wales, you're still dealing with people who are suffering the after effects of this scandal?
We are, and we come into contact daily with families who are still suffering because of this. And as I say, people assume that this is all sorted out. The government, they dole out as little money as possible so that everybody assumes that this is now sorted. But the actual, the people that are infected, they've received very, very little support. And the charities that are set up to administer support are set up in such a way that it's just so difficult to access any funds at all. People just give up in the end.
Including the families of the people who died?
Well, families of people who died, unfortunately, there's never been any inclusion of children or dependents. There's never been any inclusion of parents who lost their children. And so, the government saying that they've increased support. Only a minority have ever received any support, and that support is minimal.
Thank you very much for coming to speak to us about this morning. That's Lynne Kelly from Haemophilia Wales, and we'll have more on this story throughout the programme.
This is Good Morning Wales
with Oliver Hydes and Rachael Garside.
BBC Radio Wales.
Lynne's here now with the news. Morning, Lynne.
Good morning. Thank you, Ollie. A debate will be held in the Assembly later, with AMs calling on the UK government to hold a public inquiry into the Tainted blood scandal, in which thousands of patients were given contaminated blood in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Many developed hepatitis C and HIV. 280 people were infected in Wales, leading to 70 deaths. Lynne Kelly from Haemophilia Wales told this programme that people are still suffering.
The government dole out as little money as possible so that everybody assumes that this is now sorted. But the people that are infected, they've received very, very little support. And the charities that are set up to administer support are set up in such a way that it's just so difficult to access any funds at all. People just give up in the end.
7 minutes past 8 o'clock. And this is BBC Radio Wales. Good morning. And we're here till 9 o'clock this morning when Jason will be alongside Jason, Wynne and Eleri through until 4 today on the station. And we're leading away with a discussion regarding a story that we've covered in the past and has resurfaced, this tainted blood scandal, which you may recall that affected patients in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And today a group of Assembly members is calling on the UK government to hold a public inquiry. Thousands of people in the UK were given contaminated blood and as a result developed hepatitis C and HIV. 70 people in Wales have died as a result. Last year, the Welsh Government announced extra financial support for patients living here who'd received contaminated blood. And at the end of last year, the UK government announced additional support. But the case remains, says a group of AMs, for a public inquiry. And one of them, the Labour AM for Cardiff North, Julie Morgan, is with us now. It's the chair of the cross-party group on haemophilia and contaminated blood. Good morning.
Good morning.
And also David Thomas from Penarth, whose story we've been hearing throughout the morning. Morning to you, David.
Good morning.
Yes, we've heard your story briefly a couple of times this morning. You were infected with hepatitis C after you were given contaminated blood as a teenager in the 1980s.
Yeah.
So how's that affected your life?
Well, it's just put a sort of black cloud over my life, really, for the last 30 years since I've known, or 20 years since I was actually diagnosed with it. Your access to things like life insurance is denied, and the sort of compensation that's been offered by the government to date has just been inadequate at best.
What do you get?
We received a payment, an ex gratia payment back in 1990, which was a 20,000, I think.
That was a one-off.
Yeah. And recently the payment scheme has been revised, so we're now eligible for a £3,500 payment. That's
Was that a one-off again?
No. That's a yearly payment, but that's for stage 1 people like myself, sort of pre-cirrhotic, if you like, and then people who.
What does pre-cirrhotic mean?
Haven't yet gone into full-blown cirrhosis, so. Borderline cirrhotic, whatever.
And that's an inevitability for you, is it?
There's a possibility I may not develop cirrhosis, but you have to sort of bear in mind that there's a possibility you could as well. So you have to change your lifestyle and whatever. And then stage 2, people who have developed cirrhosis and potentially gone on to have liver transplants or whatever are eligible for a slightly more enhanced payment of about, I think, £13,000 a year.
But not enough, you say?
Not enough to, some people are forced out of work due to ill health and are sort of scrabbling around for charitable payments when really they should be having meaningful compensation.
Julie Morgan, let's deal with this case of support schemes, because I mentioned the government announced that the UK government last year more than doubled the annual spend on this to £125 million. Do you see that as sufficient?
Well, the haemophilia patients and their families themselves don't see it as sufficient. One of the big causes of concern is the families that are left after a patient has died, the widows, for example. And I think the widows, the proposal is just a one-off £10,000, which does seem totally inadequate, just a one-off payment. So what's happening in Wales at the moment is that consultation is going on about what the payment should be, and there have been consultation meetings all over Wales, so that consultation is finishing now, so we don't know yet what the payments will be in Wales.
And you'd like to see a public inquiry. Let's just put this in the context of a letter to Diana Johnson MP, who raised this in PMQs last autumn. I've got a copy of the letter here from the Prime Minister, who, in response to a call for a public inquiry, pointed out that Lord Archer of Sandwell and Lord Penrose have already undertaken separately thorough independent inquiries within the last decade. Neither inquiry found the governments of the day to have been at fault and did not apportion blame. And the Prime Minister went on to dismiss calls for a public inquiry on those grounds. Why are you raising it again now?
Well, it's risen to the surface again, partly because of the controversy about the payments. But I think it's important to remember that David Cameron, before he left office, did apologise for what had happened. So in some sense, you could say he did accept some blame for the government. But these inquiries have not been full-blown statutory inquiries. The Archer inquiry, for example, had no power to compel witnesses, and the Department of Health did not refuse to give oral evidence. And they weren't there to look at why it happened. They were there to see what could be done in the future. I think that the haemophilia community wants to know why this happened, why blood transfusions weren't stopped when it was well known at that time that there was a risk of contaminated blood. Why did documents go missing? A whole load of documents went missing under a mysterious 10-year rule, which nobody knows what that is even. So there's lots of questions to be answered, and I don't think that this issue will ever be laid to rest until there is an absolutely full-blown public inquiry.
Well, maybe the most important point in this letter is what that inquiry might mean for patients. So let's put it to David here, and I'll read you what the then Prime Minister said in this letter. Which was, the government does not believe that another inquiry would be in the best interests of sufferers and their families, as it would further delay action to address their concerns and would curtail plans to reform the existing support schemes. How do you feel about a call for an inquiry on those grounds?
I fully endorse a call for an inquiry. I think it's the only way that we will ever sort of get to the truth, as Julie touched upon. The Department of Health haven't been completely open. Documents have been withheld. Some documents were allegedly destroyed. it smells a little bit of a cover-up. Penrose itself had sort of limited effect because of the terms of reference. The Archer report, if you read the recommendations to the Archer report, they were sort of massively improved upon the situation that we currently have.
You allege a cover-up. Beholden upon me to point out these were two separate independent inquiries.
Yeah, as I say, the Archer recommendations, although they didn't apportion blame, the actual recommendations themselves suggested a level of compensation that would, compensate these people in a sort of manner that, really speaking, there was blame somewhere for this, and ultimately, we've got 2,000 dead haemophiliacs. The remainder living with the consequences of HIV or hepatitis C, yet nobody to blame. Widows given £10,000 for lives that have been taken away, fathers that are no longer here.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, David Thomas there, and thank you as well to Julie Morgan, the Labour Assembly member for Cardiff North. It's 8:15.
This is Good Morning Wales. These are our headlines this morning. Assembly members are calling for a public inquiry into the tainted blood scandal, as we've just been discussing, that led to the deaths of 70 people in Wales.